Now, battered women syndrome is something that's pretty well known in the culture, and this syndrome was developed by a Nova professor here, and her name is Dr. Lenore Walker. You can see that book there. This is a very famous book, and she's very well known for battered women syndrome. But what actually is a syndrome? And a syndrome is a group of symptoms that cluster together, that characterize a disease or a disorder. So that's what we think of when we think of syndrome. And what battered women syndrome is a woman's reaction to a pattern of continued physical and or psychological abuse inflicted on her by her mate. And so, although this isn't a diagnosis that we'll find in the DSM, this is a pattern of behavior that Dr. Walker identified in women who have this history of abuse. And those women have a cluster of symptoms that are similar to one another, and we define that as a syndrome. So these are some of the highlights. If you're really interested in this, you can go to www.drlenorewalker.com and look at lots more about battered women syndrome. You could probably buy her book. She'd probably be very happy about that. But it came out in, I think, 1984, so you could probably get it pretty cheap used. But here's some of the symptoms of battered women syndrome. The woman believes that the violence was her fault. They actually take blame for the violence. Like, oh, I just upset him, I did this, I did that. The woman has an inability to place the responsibility for the violence elsewhere. So it's her, it rests in her, solely in her. The woman fears for her life and or her children's lives. So she believes that there's a legitimate threat to her or her children. And the last one is that the woman has an irrational belief that the abuser is omnipresent or omniscient. So always around and all-knowing. Those are the four main characteristics found in battered women syndrome. And over there is Dr. Walker. So I said we can't use the DSM to diagnose battered women syndrome. The DSM really, as like a psychologist, and a lot of other professions use the DSM, that's really like your Bible, and that's where all your diagnoses should come from. But when you have an individual that has the characteristics of battered women syndrome, it's pretty easy for them to fit the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can look this up. Why don't you Google this? We're not going to read all this. But basically, this is someone that's been exposed to a traumatic event in which the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity. So being in an abusive relationship like that and having the fear of losing one's life would count as that. And the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So here, really, it's fear and helplessness. So if you were a forensic psychologist and you had a client that came to you that related a history of trauma or abuse with their husband, and maybe they did something bad. Maybe they did something horrific. Maybe they fought back. Maybe they murdered their husband. What would be a potential legal defense? How do we enter battered women syndrome into the courtroom? And I think this actually comes up on your midterm, so you might want to pay attention here. What would you do? I mean, just think about it for a minute. Well, one is you could use a self-defense as an explanation for the behavior. And what that is the use of reasonable force to protect oneself or family members from bodily harm from the attack of an aggressor if the defender has reason to believe that he or she are in danger. Here, the force that's used in self-defense may be sufficient from protection from apparent harm. So it's got to be like an actual physical threat, but it cannot be an excuse just to continue the attack or use excessive force. So that woman that I showed you at the beginning, I think her name is Nancy Seaman, So when she stabbed her husband 57 times, it doesn't really fit the criteria for self-defense, because it wasn't like her husband was attacking her and she had to stab him away 57 times. I think a majority of the stab wounds were in his back. So it wasn't like they were defensive in nature. But here, you could theoretically use the insanity defense. Clear and convincing evidence that at the time of the commission of the acts constituting the offense, the defendant, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, was unable to appreciate the nature and quality of the wrongfulness of his acts. So here you would want to probably make the link between a diagnosis from the DSM like PTSD, but it's kind of a stretch, so you can see the dilemma here. Now, unfortunately, this chapter talks about something else that is not quite pleasant, and we have to talk about it, but that's rape. And there's really some startling, scary misconceptions about rape in this country. And this isn't something that I personally like to talk about, but in teaching this class over the years, I found it fascinating. And there's some, up here, I say facts about rape. These are not facts. So whatever you do, do not say that these are facts. And this is on your midterm too. These are myths. There are lots and lots of myths about rape. And it's really scary. But as a forensic psychologist, you could go into a courtroom as an expert witness and explain to the jury that research has shown that this is not true, but a lot of people believe this. And every year I get students on their midterm, even on their finals, that say that these things are true. And people believe this. Different populations have different beliefs about rape. So one of the myths about rape is, one thing that, people believe this, is that women cannot be raped against their will. So in some way they consent to a rape. That is totally not true. Next one is women secretly wish to be raped. And that's just ridiculous to me, but people believe this. And then the last one here is most accusations of rape are faked. That is not true either. So every time I run this over in a class, people go, whoa, wait. Why would somebody wear that outfit unless they secretly wanted to be raped? Or, I've heard of this case where somebody faked a claim of rape. Just because you've heard it once does not mean that most accusations of rape are fake. So this is really something that's kind of horrifying, yet fascinating at the same time. So when you see this, you know that these are not facts, these are myths. And there is a syndrome that is associated with rape. So a forensic psychologist may be called in to do a psychological assessment, and this might be part of legal proceedings or something like that. So these rape trauma syndrome is a set of symptoms that people report who have been raped or sexually abused. So there's two phases to this, and although this isn't in the DSM, this is part of the scientific literature and it's accepted by the field. So if you see these sets of criteria in an individual, you know that it's associated with this rape trauma syndrome. So phase 1 includes shaking, trembling, racing heart, pain, tight muscles, rapid breathing, numbness. This is the acute crisis phase. This is immediately after the attack. In this phase, a lot of times people will be in denial. They'll believe that this actually didn't happen. They might physically say, like, this couldn't have happened to me, this didn't happen to me, maybe this was a dream. You'll see acute disruptions in sleep patterns and appetite. A lot of times the individual will feel guilty, or they might actually become hostile or blame Maybe they'll put the blame on themselves. You might see regression to helplessness or dependency. They're no longer the independent individuals that they once were. They might stay in their home. They might not be able to go to work or the grocery store. And you'll see distorted perceptions with distrust, pessimism about the world, paranoia. And I mean, this kind of makes sense if you think about it. And again, it's this set of symptoms that kind of cluster together and form the syndrome. And then the long-term reactions are phobias. So there might be classical conditioning that occurs. So the individual might become afraid of the dark or afraid of a certain part of town, anything that's associated with the trauma. And there could be just disturbances in general functioning, and there could be disturbances in day-to-day functioning. So like sleep patterns, self-care, work, pleasure, things like that. And there might be impacts on sexual functioning too. Specifically negative effects on the individual's sex life. Specifically here, you would see a reduction in the subjective quality of their sex life. And then changes in lifestyle. So they might restructure their lifestyle, maybe in avoidance of certain things as a part of a coping mechanism to the trauma. Okay, so that's the end of syndrome evidence. I know I went through this pretty quickly. Refer to your textbook to really get a better understanding of this material. The two topic areas that I think are very important are battered women syndrome, and this is for the midterm, so focus on battered women syndrome. Obviously we have a professor here at the university that is responsible for battered women syndrome, so I probably know her name, and then to a lesser degree I would know about rape trauma syndrome. But know what a syndrome is, and think about if you had a client like this and they came into your office, what would you do as a forensic psychologist? So that's it. Study this material and get ready for the midterm.